History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 154, The Development of Roman Theatre, a reprised conversation with Dr Elodie Palliard. As you know from last week's episode, I'm running a short series of guest episodes before we get back to continuing the journey through the Shakespeare and Jonson canon. Today's episode is a repeat of episode 30 of the podcast, first released in late 2020. At that time, I was discussing the early theatre of Rome, and with the ancient Greek theatre already under my belt, I'd started to reach out to academics and authors who could add depth and colour to the research that I'd been able to do. This episode was, I thought, particularly helpful in describing the likely developments in theatre in the murky period between the end of recorded Athenian theatre and early Roman theatre. It is, I think, worth another listen if you heard it at the time, or a first listen if you've only joined us for the later theatrical periods. Dr Elodie Palliard is currently an honorary associate in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at the University of Sydney, and a partner investigator in the Australian Research Council Discovery Project, Theatre and Autocracy in Ancient Greece. She's also a project leader at the University of Basel, financed by the Swiss National Science Foundation. After completing her PhD thesis on the staging of socio-political groups in Sophocles, and a postdoctorate on Greek theatre in early imperial Rome and Campania, Elodie is now working on Greek theatre in Republican Italy 500 to 27 BCE. She is also a member of the editorial board of the journal Mediterranean Archaeology. I spoke to Elodie over Zoom from her office in Basel. So there's a general agreement that the Roman theatre was influenced by Greek theatre, and we can identify where Greek comedy was freely adapted by the Roman playwrights, and there's lots of evidence that Menander in particular was held in very high regard by the Romans. So do you see the transition of Greek to Romans as simply a question of the Romans copying the Greeks, or is there much more to it than that?
Well, I think you might guess the answer. There is much more to it than that. It is much more complicated, and we don't know all of the parameters that were behind the transition from Greek to Roman theatre. Of course, the influence of Greek theatre is very easy to spot in Roman drama, especially in Roman comedy. And the influence of Menander is very clear. But I think that the best way to answer the question is perhaps to take things in a chronological order and to start back with what happens after Menander.
Okay.
So, like, Greek theatre doesn't die after Menander. There is still a lot going on Greek theatre stages after Menander. And recent scholarship has made a lot of progress into learning more about what was going on in the post-classical world of Greek theatre. So Greek drama, Greek tragedy, Greek comedy kept evolving after Menander, kept being performed. It was still an ongoing process. There was no real feeling of decline of Greek theatre after the classical period. I think that's very much a myth that has various reasons behind it. But there is no death of Greek theatre after the classical period. It was very much something that was still alive. So it means that when we are looking at the origin of Roman theatre, we must count on influences that could come not only from classical plays or from established, let's say, or classical authors like Menander, but also from a variety of other performances, live performances that people could attend at the time. And besides the tradition of Greek theatre, there was also a very lively, a lot of theatrical activities in Italy itself from local Italic traditions. Like we know that Etruscans or Oscans had a lot of theatrical activities, and they influenced the shaping of Roman drama as well. So how does it work? Like Roman drama emerged really at a time where around Rome and in Italy itself, there was a bit of a blending of Greek theatrical tradition, local Italic theatrical traditions. And as Rome expanded into Italy, it came into contact with local theatrical activities. And then when it when Rome went further south, it became in more direct contact with Greek theatrical tradition, because the south of Italy was still very much a Greek area before the Roman conquest. That's how the story goes. That's where we think that the influence of Greek theater was really at the heart of what we qualify now as Roman drama. There is this landmark, if you want, with Livius Andronicus in 240 BC, who was supposedly captured during the conquest of Tarentum by the Romans. And he is credited with being the first one to have translated first the Odyssey into Latin, and then to have translated a Greek play, tragedy or comedy, into Latin. So here I just, perhaps it's good to stop a bit on the word translate.
Please, that's always an interesting question.
I mean, it's important that we don't imagine a translation of a Greek play into Latin as a translation that we have in, face-to-face books where you have the Latin on one side and the English on the other side. It's not that. It's an adaptation. It's not following the words of the Greek poet and translating them simply into a new language. It's adapting a Greek play into a new context, for a new culture, for a different audience. So translation is probably not the right word, but if we keep that in mind, let's say, if you want, that's the most direct influence of Greek theater into the origin of Roman theater can be pinpointed here in that very particular moment when Livius Andronicus has translated a Greek play into Latin.
Right, and we think that is very much an adaptation of an original, so bringing something Roman to it.
Yes, absolutely. There is. It's very important to keep that in mind. There is something Roman, even in later plays that look so much like Menander plays. There is a Roman input in it, but there is a bit more to it than that as well. Because if we look at Roman comedies, there were different subgenres of Roman comedies. Not all of them were very much influenced by Greek comedies, for example. Some of them, they might have been more influenced by local Italic forms of theater, like the Atellan or the Oscan farce that were, shorter pieces, like sketches, if you want, little funny moments of perhaps 15, 20 minutes, rather than a full big comedy like we can imagine being a comedy of Menander. So all of that was influencing the process, if you want, the evolution, the origin of Roman drama and Roman comedy in particular. So it's very important, I think, to keep in mind that, yes, there is a bit of truth in seeing Greek theater as the model behind Roman theater, but there is indeed much more to it than that.
Yes, and the Romans seem to have a preference for comedy, basically. They did adapt tragedies, but not anything to the extent, or as far as we can tell from what survived, that they enjoyed comedy.
Yeah, it might be true, but I would like to be a bit to give you a bit more nuance on that, because as you say exactly, we always depend on what has survived, and in many cases we know of Roman tragedies of which nothing has survived, but they still existed, which might indicate that there have been many more than what we actually have. And even for Roman comedies, not much has survived. There must have been much more. And here, I think it's good to say a few words about so-called minor genres, if you want. When we think about comedy, we think about tragedy, we think about a very formal sort of spectacle, if you want, with really codified, with a structure that was really inspired from the Greek model, if you want. But there were so many other minor genres, as I said before, like the Oscan farce or the Atellane, but there were mimes as well. There were shorter pieces that could be funny, that could be less funny. And they came to have quite a lot of success in the Roman world as well. And despite the fact that we know almost nothing about them, because they were less based on a formal written script than a long comedy or a long tragedy. So a long comedy or a long tragedy, you can be pretty sure that there was a poet behind it, writing it, or at least composing it. And then you can have the text transmitted to us. For minor genres or shorter pieces that were sometimes improvised, if there is no written text behind them, then they don't survive up to us. It doesn't mean that they were less successful or less composed, but we just don't have them anymore, unfortunately.
So at some point, somebody made a choice about which ones were to be preserved, because that was an expensive business. Copying out a text multiple times by hand was not as easy, before the printing press, was not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. There has been conscious choices about what was worthy of copying, and sometimes it had to do with what was best for to be turned into educational material. So things that you could teach in schools, or things that were seen as having some sort of moral value or philosophical value, or sometimes historical value, they would be much more copied than things that looked like just composed for a bunch of people to have fun around. And it's not the same thing as today, where you can pretty much record anything and you don't really have to make a choice. So there is this conscious process of choosing what can be preserved for what should be preserved for the future, if you want. But there is also this simply historical luck, if you want, historical chance, things that were not composed in writing originally. They simply could not survive. You could not record them. So, they just disappeared.
And of the things like the farces and the short comedy sketches you were talking about just there, really we don't have anything but, do we even have fragments of those, or are we just going on how they've been reported by later commentators?
Well, there is a bit of that as well. We have authors who say what they thought about that kind of spectacles, of course. And given that our sources are rather, or almost exclusively, very elite and very educated, you can imagine what they thought about that. But the other thing that was going on in Rome at the time was that some of those minor genres kind of found their way into more literary shapes. Like we have more literary mimes, for example, or even more literary Atellans. And those I mean, I'm not quite sure if we have a lot of that, or even if we have anything at all, but they might have had a better chance at surviving for longer than something that was less literary, if you want.
Yeah, again, so it's a choice somebody is making about what is proper literature and what is just entertainment for the masses and of no value preserving.
Yeah, but it's in some cases you can say who or what group made the choice, but in some cases it's sometimes a matter of the society in itself, if you want. What did this particular cultural society value, how it was perceived, and then the choice makes itself by itself, if you want. Some things just don't survive, and that's it. It doesn't mean that then they were not important for the spectators. I mean, the spectators could have liked those short non-literary pieces much more than attending a comedy of Plautus or Terence. But that doesn't really correlate with keeping those little pieces for posterity.
Right. And we can see, I think, because I've covered the Theatre of Pompeii in some detail in one episode and talked about the other permanent theatres in Rome. And they were these huge buildings that seated thousands and thousands of people and appear to be incredibly popular, but never quite as popular as going to the circus, watching gladiators beating up other gladiators and that kind of thing, which is one of these strange things about Roman society that I myself have, a bit of a problem getting my head around what these people really did enjoy and how they could move from one moment watching effectively an execution of another human being and then wanting to go and see a play. It's a difficult one, I think.
Yeah, it is a very, very difficult question, and I'm not quite sure we have the right answer. More often than not, we have absolutely no clear idea of what was going on in those theaters. So, first thing, if you simply ask me, tell me a play that was performed in the theater in Pompeii, I can't. I mean, there is a bit of indirect evidence about what kind of spectacle would have taken place in such big theaters. But there is no way we can, as we can in Athens. In Athens, you can say in this theater, such play was performed in such year. We don't have that for most of the time for Rome. And yeah, the theater of the permanent theater in Rome is a very, very late acquisition, if you want, on the theatrical stage in Rome. So everything that was performed before the time it was established was on temporary stages. So it means that it might have been a very much more intimate spectacle than what was going on in those big theaters. And again, it shapes a bit how much Roman early playwrights could import from Greek drama and what couldn't really be translated into the new Latin medium, because the context, the condition for the performances were different.
I think it would be very difficult to present one of those really serious Greek tragedies when you're in the middle of a marketplace on a temporary stage with the world going on around you in the forum or wherever.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you could perhaps present extracts or little scenes of a Greek tragedy if you want. But if you are really performing on a marketplace in a suburb of Rome, first you better perform in Latin, because otherwise not everyone would understand and people would get bored quite easily, I think. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a shame that we don't know much more about what was going on in terms of theatrical activities in Rome, but it is much, much richer than simply having re-performances of Greek plays and Greek plays translated into Latin. There was a lot. We don't know about what it was, but there was a lot going on. And as you say, the sheer size of those big theater buildings indicates that there was a demand, there was an audience for theatrical performances. Of what sort exactly, then the question is difficult to answer.
Yes, I think coming as someone who came to this with very little knowledge about Roman theatre, that was my biggest surprise, that because it never really gets mentioned. We always hear about the games and the chariot races, gladiators, but never about Roman theatre as a mass spectacle.
Yeah, and the problem was already felt at the time. There is a Roman comedy, if I remember well, where the playwright complains that his play is performed at the same time as as an athletic contest or a boxer's fights in some other plays, and that spectators are actually leaving the theater to attend rather the more exciting spectacle. So we don't quite know whether it has any kind of historical reality, these anecdotes, but it means that indeed theater had to compete with all those other kind of entertainments that were much more spectacular, much more visual. And, if you think that in classical Greek theater, there was this kind of rule, if you want, or at least this habit of not showing anyone being killed on stage. So that's something that was pretty much respected in classical Greek plays. You have a messenger coming on stage to tell you what happens when someone got killed, but the death in itself is not shown on stage. So to Romans who are used to see gladiatorial fights or hunts or with lots of blood and dead people around or animals, then it must have sounded simply ridiculous. And here again, there is an influence of Greek theater, but there is a lot of other kind of parameters going on into what was Latin theater, what was Roman drama.
So in your work, you've looked at the question of how far Greek theatre survived alongside Latin theatre. And you already mentioned there that the southern part of Italy was heavily influenced by Greek. Indeed, there's Greek colonies there at the time. Can you say something about to what extent Greek theatre coexisted with Latin theatre? And apart from the fact there were some Greek people living in Italy, was there another reason why it carried on?
Yeah, again, that's a very, very interesting question. Thank you. Because sometimes we think that when Latin theater is invented, it's not the right word, but let's use it. When Latin theater is invented, then Greek theater disappears. It's not true. The Greek and Roman drama, Greek and Latin theater coexisted for a long, long time, for centuries, after the invention of Latin drama. After this 240 BC, the time when we have this Livius Andronicus translating the first play into Latin, Greek theater was still performed. So the reason for that, there are many reasons. One of the easiest reason to discuss is probably the fact that simply the eastern part of the Mediterranean was a Greek-speaking area. Even with the development and the extension of Rome, Greece and the East were still Greek-speaking areas. In those places, there was absolutely no demands, no need for Latin drama. And so Greek drama was still performed in those parts of the empire, if you want. And what is especially interesting is that those big games or big contests at which we had categories for competition for Greek theater. Everyone knows about the Olympic Games, but there were many other places in Greece and in the East where there were regular big competition shaped as religious festivals at which there were contests for Greek plays. And those things, they still existed. Even when Rome conquered Greece and then went further east and went everywhere around the Mediterranean basin, it still existed, those big festivals. And they were part of a well-established circuit with Greek performers that began at some point to be organized as kind of powerful, if you want, associations. So it means Greek theater was not just a matter of transmitting old plays and then re-performing it. It was still a very much evolving medium, something that was still experienced by many people in the Eastern Mediterranean and elsewhere as well. As for Rome and Italy itself, the question is a bit different, because when we think about Rome and Italy, Rome, it's the heart of the Roman Empire. It's the heart of even before it became an empire, it's really the heart of Roman or Latin culture. So why would people keep organizing performances of Greek plays in Rome and in Italy, whereas it was pretty much the center of Latin culture, and from 240 BC, theater in Latin existed? So why would you do that? Why would you organize a performance in Greek, whereas everyone around you speaks Latin and Latin is the dominant culture in the area? So that was the object of my current and previous research project. So again, as for many other questions around those lines, the evidence is a bit scarce. But still, there is good evidence that performances in Greek took place in Roman Italy, in places where Roman culture was dominant, as well as in places like Naples or southern Italy, where the Greek influence was still very much felt. But even in Rome itself, we have evidence for performances in Greek. And that indeed raises many questions. Why would you do that, frankly? So I have a few suggestions as answers, if you want. One of the reasons had to do, of course, with the prestige of classical Greek theater. And classical Greek theater was very, very early idealized as an art form. And, even when Rome tried to define its identity, it always had to articulate itself compared to Greek culture, if you want. So it was generally true, but it was true for theater as well. Latin theater existed, but Greek theater was the model to imitate, but the model to, improve on and to sometimes modify. And you could play on that as almost infinitely. So there is this notion of ideal classical Greek theater, this prestige, if you want, of Greek theater that was still felt, that might have been the reason behind why you would, from time to time, still re-perform a classical Greek play or a play of Menander. Another of the reasons is a bit linked to what I was saying before. These circuits, those big, important religious festivals all around the Mediterranean were established very much within a Greek framework. And as Rome developed, there was a need to be included into this Mediterranean framework, if you want, into this circuit. And then, of course, you would have to make the Greek performers feel welcome. Otherwise, they would have not have been included into that context, into that circuit. So that might be another reason. Again, another reason might have been simply the fact that the Greek performers were more experienced and more highly regarded as local Roman performers. So if you want to attract the most talented actors, for example, and if you know that they spoke only Greek or they used to only perform in Greek, then you had to organize a performance in Greek language, not in Latin, because you would like to have the best performers. So that's another reason. And then the same question can be asked again for the imperial period. There are again some other reasons why emperors would have liked to organize Greek plays in Rome and in Italy and all over the Mediterranean. So some of the reasons I mentioned before are still valid for the imperial period, of course. But there is something to add to that, I think, in the fact that Roman emperors used their kind of imagined and alleged links to classical culture to legitimate their own imperialistic ambitions. So that's something that started before already, but there was this idea, whether it was clearly expressed or not, that to be a legitimate emperor, to be a legitimate ruler in the Mediterranean area, you would have to be familiar, you would have to be close to Greek culture because of the idealization of the Athenian classical model. So that might be one of the reasons why Roman emperors like to have Greek plays performed, like to have contact with associations of Greek performers or theatrical practitioners. So that's something that we have to, I think, keep in mind, these links between the autocratic rule of the emperor and the idealized Greek past.
Yeah, that's probably another thing that's quite difficult for us to imagine, because the Romans were the conqueror in this case, and quite, very, very effectively so. But they seemed very willing in many areas, and obviously theatre is one of them, from what you're saying, to adopt the Greek model and to see something that they really liked about the Greek theatre, the Greek way of life generally, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. There is always this tension. I mean, it's a fascinating topic of research, of inquiry. This articulation between Roman and Greek culture, between Roman and Greek identity. So there is always this tension in Rome. They conquered Greece militarily, if you want, at some point. So they were definitely stronger physically or at a military level. But culturally, if you take theater, there is something that is quite interesting too. It is the fact that Latin drama or theater in Latin kind of dies very quickly. At some point, it seems that there are no new comedies or tragedy in Latin that are created anymore. And Greek theater spread all around the Mediterranean, including in Rome, in Italy, which were parts of the area that didn't speak Greek mainly. It's not the case for Latin theater. There is still quite a lot of work to do to perhaps explore the spread of Latin drama to the East, but here, one of the reasons why not much has been done on that is the fact that there isn't much evidence, and there isn't many reasons why we should think that Latin drama could have spread to the East. The Greece and the eastern part of the Roman Empire were always Greek-speaking areas, and Greek culture was very much felt there. So Rome was clever enough, instead of trying to fight what was to fight a culture that was very much locally strong, to try to absorb it into into its empire, rather than replacing it by a Latin culture that was still young and perhaps not felt as strong as Greek culture was around the Mediterranean. So that's, I mean, it lead us to to a whole discussion about, imperial tactics of Rome. But I think even when we talk about something as restricted as theatre, we can see that as well.
Yes, sadly, I don't have time to go into all the nuances of the Roman Empire, but I think that's really interesting because, of course, as soon as the empire split, then Greek is the dominant language in the Byzantine Empire. I mean, we haven't got there yet, but theatre is very restricted in Byzantium because of the religious influence. And although Justinian did manage to marry an actress. That just as a side question on all of that, I mean, you're talking about the lack of evidence there is for a lot of this. At what rate are we discovering new evidence? I was reading about Menander's plays being discovered in Egyptian papyri when mummies were opened in 1950 something, I think it was. So, I mean, is there much new evidence that comes to light, or are we really going over what we have and that's it?
Well, you can always hope for chance discoveries like this Menander. But quite frankly, it happens very rarely. So we work with what we have, and we hope for more papyrological discoveries and for the publication of new inscriptions sometimes. Epigraphy, inscriptions are another source of evidence that is quite important for theatre as well. It's not only a matter of reading and rereading Cicero 10,000 times and trying to find the new interpretation that no one had thought about to extract new evidence about theatre. No, sometimes it's good to have a look at inscriptions as well. So other documentary evidence is very helpful too. Although I must say that in my own research, having a look at what was available for Italy and Rome, so there are thousands and millions of inscriptions from Rome and Italy, from from Republican time to the early Empire. But bizarrely, I found that not much gives us very good information about theatre. They didn't seem to be that interested in recording what was performed, for example. You don't get an inscription on the theatre that tells you, oh, in this theatre, this playwright presented his play and it's such and such day. So we don't have that. What we have is, for example, tombstones with inscription that record that the deceased person was an actor or a performer or something like that. But it doesn't. You don't go very far with that. I mean, one of the things I've done is trying to see whether we had tombstones of actors with Greek names much more frequently than with Latin names. So that might give us an evidence for the fact that indeed Greek performers were well renowned and were much more sought after than Latin performers. But so there is a lot to do still, but the evidence, it doesn't always answer our hopes.
I hope you enjoyed hearing that again or for the first time. My thanks to Elodie for taking the time to talk to me when I was really quite a novice podcaster and interviewer. Next time, I have a new guest episode where we will get some gorgeous detail about the boy actors of the English Renaissance stage. If you haven't done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram, Blue Sky or X, just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.